Thank you, Margaret. I really have enjoyed and do enjoy teaching in this program. I want to say logistics and transportation is just an incredibly exciting area right now. We really have some disruptive technologies that are very, very exciting with unmanned aerial vehicles, autonomous vehicles. I mean, none of us may be driving cars in 6 years. It's just very exciting. If you're old like me, perhaps you'll remember the Jetsons. I always say this is really sort of Jetson stuff. In addition to what I intend to talk about today, which is space. And it's just absolutely a fascinating area. So, how in the world did I come across this topic of space mining of all things? Was I having a daydream? What was going on? Well, actually, what I was doing was I was asked to teach the aviation regulation course this summer, and I was updating it. And I pretty quickly saw that it needed to be updated to include commercial unmanned aerial vehicles, which is really an exploding area. And as I was sort of driving into that area and reducing some of the traditional aviation focus, which is still very important to make a little room for unmanned aerial vehicles, that led me to a consideration of space. As Margaret mentioned, I'm a bit of a I was an Air Force JAG, and so I was a little steeped in Air Force lore. And in the Air Force, the doctrine really is to not think of space and air as really distinct entities, but as one operational continuum, not so much separate environments. And so it kind of got me thinking a little bit about space. And I also, when I teach these courses, I'm always very focused on looking at future technologies, particularly right around the corner, and particularly disruptive technologies that could potentially have a big impact on transportation and logistics activity and really economic activity writ large. And pretty rapidly, I stumbled across space tourism and mining as economic activities that potentially could lead to other technologies which could pretty dramatically impact transportation and logistics. And so I felt like I had to include them in the course. And so I started to look at, well, what are we really talking about with space mining and space tourism? How do they work? What could be involved? I first discovered some really quite amazing economics. Wall Street Journal had an article, I think, saying that you could literally be talking about 25 to 30 billion dollars in platinum on an asteroid, and that platinum could be mined by a spaceship costing less than $3 billion, which would be a pretty good return on investment. Saw a June 2016 article in the Observer that really opened my eyes. In 2015, an asteroid estimated to contain 90 million tons of platinum. $5.4 trillion worth passed within 2.4 million kilometers of the Earth, which is actually closer than Venus. And so clearly we have that technology to launch an unmanned satellite or ship that would reach that already. Now, of course, the mining, it may be an entirely different matter, and we're not really right there yet. But what are some of the other minerals? Well, apparently there's gold, silver, iridium. I won't try to do the rest of those jawbreakers that you're seeing on the slides, but they're quite valuable minerals on many of these asteroids. And in addition to that, there's other minerals that could be used for further space exploration, on-site construction. If you think about this may not be as crazy as it sounds, because really exploration has traditionally been economically based. I mean, when you think about the gold rushes in our country opening up California and parts of the West, I mean, people didn't suffer those travels just for fun. They did it for economic reasons. So it's really not that extraordinary. So a little bit more of the surprising economics, or what I like to call is more mineral trivia. These asteroids also contain water and oxygen for astronauts, which isn't a minor deal when you think about it. There's a severe penalty in dragging anything out of the Earth's atmosphere and overcoming the Earth's gravitational pull. So if you could sort of take your spaceship to an asteroid and at least obtain the water and oxygen for further travel, that's a very valuable thing because it's very hard to sort of take enough with you to go wherever you might want to go. So you could also think of this space mining as potentially facilitating a gas station in space, not subject to the Earth's gravity. Additionally, hydrogen, ammonia, and oxygen, which are all important components of rocket fuel, same equation really. If you don't have to drag it into space and overcome gravity, it's extremely valuable. I really enjoyed learning a little bit about this next bullet, which I call science geek stuff. So the Earth and the asteroids were made of the same material, but the Earth had as much more mass and therefore a stronger gravitational pull. And so all of these valuable heavy element minerals exist in the Earth, but they're on the core. And actually, the scientists think when the Earth was initially created, there was very little of these valuable minerals on the surface of the Earth where miners could get at them. But in the hundreds of years between, or thousands of years between when the Earth was formed and when mining became practical, we of course had a rain of asteroid impacts, and they reinfused the Earth's surface with valuable minerals. It's kind of just really interesting. You think about asteroids, they're already closer to the surface because asteroids had much less gravitational pull, and the valuable minerals were not forced to the center of the asteroid. Please don't ask too many questions on that one because I got to tell you, I'm a lawyer, not a scientist, and you'll exhaust my knowledge pretty quickly. So is this happening next week? Well, no. I'm going to be very honest. This stuff is not happening next week. There's still high launch and spaceflight costs and technology barriers. We haven't identified, you've got to still identify asteroids suitable for mining, and I was sort of surprised to learn that, you know, obviously there's some companies formed and they're probably not broadcast gravity mining techniques, as that would be extremely commercially valuable. But in a review of the literature, I was unable to find anybody discussing a zero gravity mining technique that exists right now. But there are companies out there, and I would encourage you to go to website pages. It's very interesting. Planetary Resources has already developed a LEO space telescope they're using to find and analyze asteroids, have plans for interceptor satellites and a prospector satellite. So they're well into their research and development. Deep Space Industries already has a test vehicle already in low Earth orbit. Their internet sites are absolutely fascinating. Deep Space has named their satellites they're going to develop with these quite fanciful names. You have the Fireflies that go to the asteroid and examine it, the Dragonflies that get small samples in return, the Harvesters, which of course, you know, get tons of material. And their plan is to not process it on Earth, but to process it at high Earth orbit for processing. You know, which brings up the point where we have different possibilities when you mine an asteroid. You can bring the raw material back to Earth. You can process it on site and only bring the processed material or the valuable minerals back to Earth, or you can drag the asteroid to a safe orbit around the Earth, Moon, or potentially even the International Space Station. So very fascinating technology. But after all, this is a lecture associated with a law school, and so presumably at some point I'm going to take my science geek hat off, which is pretty frayed and limited, I have to admit, and talk a little bit about the law. So seeing this coming, Congress passed and the President signed the United States Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act in 2015. And the purpose of this statute was to facilitate a pro-growth environment in order to really facilitate a commercial space industry that was already sort of starting to develop by encouraging private sector investment and try to create a more stable and predictable regulatory conditions. Really, the idea, we want to facilitate commercial exploration and commercial recovery of space resources by United States citizens. We want to try to eliminate any uncertainty and promote the right of U.S. citizens to engage in commercial exploration and commercial recovery of space resources free from any harmful interference. However, we got a very important caveat that we're going to see several times appearing in the statute and is going to become very relevant a little bit later in the lecture. we see these rights given to U.S. citizens, and then we see in accordance with the international obligations of the United States. That's going to come up again and again. And later in the lecture, it'll be sort of clear why that's so. What else does this act do? Discourages government barriers to the development of a U.S. space industry. It also provides U.S. citizens shall be entitled to any asteroid or space resource obtained, including the rights to possess, own, transport, use, and sell the asteroid resource or space resource obtained in accordance with applicable law. And here's kind of the got you again. But it's in accordance with the international obligations of the United States. Again, I won't tease this out too much longer, and here we have it. So what's the rub? The rub is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And that's been ratified by the United States. We're a party to the treaty. And what does the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is part of international law, provide? Nations can't own territories in space. Outer space shall be free from exploration and use by all states. Exploration and use of outer space is for the benefit of all. It's sort of for the good of mankind provision. Celestial bodies, specifically, are not subject to national appropriation or claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or any other means. And also, governments must approve and supervise commercial launch. Now, sort of the history buffs may be interested that this represented a compromise between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wanted language in the Outer Space Treaty that limited space to to nation states only. The United States could envision, even in those early days, the possibility of commercial launch. And so the compromise that was necessary to get enough countries to approve this was that even though private entities would be allowed to go into space, that the government from the territory from which they were launched had to approve and supervise the launch. So you read that, which seems to be very sort of anti-exploration, anti-economic use of space, and you wonder, well, what were the space nations thinking? We have to realize that in the time of this treaty, the space nations were the United States and Soviet Union and perhaps France. I can't remember my dates. France was either right around that time or a little bit after in a very limited way. So what were these space nations thinking? Well, they were thinking about Sputnik and avoiding an arms race. And you have to go back to the great fear and alarm in the United States in the late 50s and early 60s, where the Cold War was as hot as it gets, and the United States and the Soviet Union were both nuclear-armed countries. And there was this fear that the Soviet Union or the United States would put nuclear weapons in space, where they could attack a country with almost no warning by rapidly descending from their orbit. And there was more fear of that than anything else. And so what they wanted to do was really impose a space status quo where space could not be militarized, belong to everyone. For both countries, for their own reasons, really wanted to avoid any kind of competition in space. And that was really what was going on with the Outer Space Treaty. I would also say it was fair to say that exploitive technology like mining or even tourism was really probably very hard to imagine in a serious way at this point. Now, certainly, you could, there were science fiction writers who imagined that and much more, but there weren't companies formed, and there wasn't serious technology, and no one was thinking of a 10 or 15-year window to pull resources off an asteroid. And so that maybe someday in the future kind of thinking paled beside the goal of avoiding a nuclear space race. Another international treaty I want to talk about briefly is the Moon Treaty. The Moon Treaty came along many years later in the 70s. And at that point, the world had really divided into what I'll call the space haves, those countries who had some space capability, and the much greater number of nations who were space have-nots, who were not going to be able to even launch a satellite, let alone dream of exploiting the resources from a celestial body anytime soon. And by sheer numbers, it's pretty clear that the space have-nots then and now outnumber the space haves. And so the Moon Treaty banned all exploration of and use of a celestial body without approval and benefit of other states under the common heritage of mankind principle, banned altering the environment of celestial bodies, banned any state or private entity, for that matter, from claiming ownership over any celestial body. Now, interestingly enough, not a single space-capable nation has signed. And I think the objection is the Moon Treaty actually has a requirement that extracted resources and technology must be shared with other nations. So you create a scenario where if a private company from the United States went and developed that $3 or $4 trillion of minerals from an asteroid, they'd be in a position of potentially having to share it with all the nations in the world. And that's really not a scenario that's going to get investors interested in plunking down any part of that $3 billion or so that it's going to take to build the spacecraft to go get the platinum or gold or whatever in the first place. And so because of that, I think, and because by this point, the space nations really could at least start to conceive of the concept that maybe someday this would be possible. None of them signed it. So why do we care? Because some of the commentators in this area think that the concepts contained in the Moon Treaty through various conventions, UN resolutions, and speeches are creeping into the international law. And after all, I mean, I remember many years ago in the late 80s when I was in law school, I took a course in international law, and the way international law develops is somewhat fuzzy. So let's get on to the bottom line a little bit. So who wins this argument? I mean, obviously you have countries like the United States and others who would very much like to see space developed. And in the US case, we've even passed a statute providing that, again, subject to our international obligations, that US citizens can assert title in at least the minerals that gained from asteroids. And just so you know, that's how the United States tries to thread this needle. The United States policy is you cannot own an asteroid or other celestial body, but the U.S. has determined that taking the minerals from an asteroid or other celestial body is not prohibited by the OST. That's the U.S. position. International position, certainly at least as asserted by the non-space nations, is no, the OST precludes it. So, as I said, who wins the argument? Well, I don't claim to be a space lawyer. I'm a poor government contracts lawyer who spent my career reading contracts and doing some litigation for the Department of Justice. And the one thing I know is courts love to interpret statutes and for that matter, treaties under a theory called the plain language theory. And the plain language of the OST is pretty compelling. I find it difficult to argue that you can parse it out and acknowledge that you can own an asteroid, but then try to assert that you can own parts of the asteroid. Even the U.S. statute provides rights, but only to the extent that it's legal under our international obligations. I think there's also been an argument asserted that because the Outer Space Treaty does not apply to commercial entities, that doesn't apply to commercial entities, but I think that's pretty irrelevant given that the OST or the Outer Space Treaty imposes a duty on the launching nation to authorize and supervise. So I don't know how we frankly avoid that. And I hate to say it because I really think that this technology needs to happen, and the United States or companies from the United States are probably going to be able to exploit it faster than anyone. But I think a fair reading of the statute in international law is, if I was a litigator, I like the international law argument a little better. Now, on the other hand, there is sort of the moon rock scenario, and to me, I think it's a clever argument, but it also shows, I think, to some degree, how we're stretching a little bit to try to assert that the OST doesn't preclude the development or the possession of asteroid minerals. The moon rock argument is both the United States and the Soviet Union removed rocks from the moon and took them back to their respective countries during many of the moon missions, and no one in the international arena objected. And so that's precedent for the U.S. argument that you can't own a celestial body, but you can remove rocks or, dare we say, minerals from it. Not a bad argument. I think many judges would say there's a big difference between a moon rock, which has perhaps only sort of value in that it's very unique, and minerals, which are quite valuable whether you discover them in the ocean, on land, or in space. Practicality. I think, when you have a situation where there's $4 trillion of valuable minerals closer to the Earth than Venus, and it can't be exploited because no one will invest in the technology because there's this argument that you would immediately have to share it with everyone or it's illegal. I don't think that's very practical. I mean, I think the economics are very compelling, and these are scarce minerals that are getting scarcer. And because of that, I just think that there's going to have to be a way found to allow this technology. And a 1967 treaty that was written, frankly, in the middle of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were scared to death that we were going to blow each other up, is not going to be allowed to get in the way of such dollars. What's next? Well, this is probably good news for the lawyers. I think lots of lawyers and lots of lawyering. I think this is going to have to be sorted one way or the other. Obviously, nation states are pretty free to ignore international law if they want, but there are pretty severe political consequences. And so I think there's going to be a real effort to try to sort of finesse this and not just flat out say, well, we don't care about the OST and we don't care about international courts saying it precludes space mining. We're going to do it anyway. I mean, that may happen, but I think before it does, there's going to be a real effort and energy to try to figure out a way to sort of allow mining in a reasonable way and not stop it. Both domestic and international opportunities. For those of you not in the United States, in my research for this, I discovered, of all things, Luxembourg wants to be a real center of space mining activity, and they passed a law similar to the U.S. statute, providing companies operating out of Luxembourg can take title to U.S. resource or to asteroid resources, and they've also created a very favorable legal regime. I don't know if Luxembourg's location allows a spaceport. I would assume it does, although they don't have much land, but they are very much trying to become a space mining power, which I just find fascinating, how a little country like Luxembourg gets into that business and why they choose to go that way. But it's just an interesting sort of trivial thing. I think ultimately what we're going to look at is there's going to have to be a creative solution required to keep as many people happy. I think it's unlikely we're going to be able to come up with a new treaty. We're very divided, both in this country and in the world, in 2017. And normally treaties develop through the consensus process. And, the situation is there are so many non-space nations compared to the few space nations. I just don't know how the space nations get a treaty that really gets them where they need to go. And yet, on the other hand, most of the space nations want to damage international law as little as possible and don't necessarily want to find themselves in a position where they are just flat out blowing off international law. Little more trivia on Luxembourg. $200 million Euro credit fund to fund space mining initiatives. So see, it's real. I'm not making it up. And both of the leading companies now have finalized agreements with the country to use Luxembourg as a center for asteroid mining. This one is probably the one that got most of my attention. One of my students in the current course actually brought this to my attention, and he and I tracked it down together. But in 2017, NASA awarded a contract, not a huge one, but a contract nevertheless, to Deep Space, one of the two companies I mentioned, to develop technology to extract minerals from asteroids and return them to Earth's orbit. Specifically, they wanted to look into aerobraking technology, which surrounds asteroid minerals with a heat shield to slow them down such to a point they don't burn off as they enter the Earth's atmosphere. So when you see NASA letting government contracts for this, you've got to believe that, gosh, maybe this is going to happen, and maybe it's going to happen kind of soon. So as we always do, and whether we get questions or not, I like to leave a fair amount of time for questions. And I've done a few of these lectures, and no one has ever yelled at me for being done a little bit early, but I have been yelled at for going too long. So I'm going to be done a little bit early, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions, or if people don't have questions, to get back to their lunch. But if everybody would bear with me for just another few seconds, I kind of formed some conclusions. I mean, what a fascinating issue, and I'm very thankful for Margaret to allow me to participate in this program, because I keep coming across really exciting, interesting legal issues that I got to say in my normal government contracts practice, I really probably would not come across. And I think when you see one like this is really a fascinating issue that really illustrates how international law, most practicing lawyers, I think sometimes we think international law is this fuzzy stuff they do with the UN that really doesn't matter very much. But here we see it really front and center, involved in slowing down, or at least being a factor in an incredibly economically valuable enterprise. And so it kind of made me glad that I took international law and made me appreciate international law, because it is a very interesting legal issue. Second bullet, I mean, maybe it's because, I'm getting a little bit older, but I'm like, holy cow, some of this Buck Rogers space technology stuff is really starting to come to pass. Autonomous vehicles, UAV technology, and now space mining. It seems like every time I do a little bit of work in this program, I'm excited to be confronted with some technologies that could very dramatically change the U.S. economy, and even for an old guy like me, are frankly not something you can ignore. I mean, we all drive, and if all of a sudden all the other cars on the highway don't have people driving, that's probably something I'm going to notice. Third bullet, I just can't see OST being renegotiated because of the problem I mentioned, where there's a lot of have-nots as far as space capability versus haves. That may change, but I don't know if it's going to change fast enough. So I don't know what the solution is going to be, whether it's going to be sort of the United States solution where you come up with a colorable legal argument and press on, whether it may be another country's solution to just do it and not even really care about the legal argument, because maybe that's a country that cares less about international law. Maybe it even could be something where there would be a way to sort of pay off the non-space nations to some degree, and yet preserve enough profit incentive for a country or a company to develop the technology to get these resources. I think finally, it's very interesting to me, and I may be totally wrong on this. I mean, again, I have said several times, I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer. But it's very interesting to me whether it's a 5 or 10 or 15-year reality. And those are the three numbers that I picked out. And for what it's worth, from my reading of the research, and again, I could be scary wrong and it could happen in 2 years, but my gut is I think we're between 5 and 10 years of someone bringing some platinum or other valuable mineral that was mined in outer space back to the Earth and have it enter into the economic activity of countries on the Earth. So, I mean, it's not probably next month, but it is right around the corner, and it's going to happen soon.